Before dawn on Saipan, in the summer of 1944, an 18-year-old Marine did something no order had told him to do. He crawled out alone into the dark, past his own sleeping lines, toward a cave that breathed. You could hear it if you got close enough, the shuffle of feet on stone, the whimper of a being hushed, the small sounds of hundreds of people packed into the rock. And every one of them had been taught for years exactly what he was: a demon, a criminal, a monster who had murdered his own mother and father to earn the uniform he wore. This is a true story. Keep that in mind, because it is about to ask a great deal of you. Imagine you are that boy. You have no armor against what waits in the dark. No rifle solves it. The people in that cave believe that to be pappered by you is worse than dying. And out on the cliffs at the northern tip of the island, others are already proving how deeply they believe it, stepping off the edge into the sea rather than let an American touch them alive. All you have is a canteen of water and a handful of rough words in their language, the language of a family that once fed you at their table, a family your own country had locked behind barbed wire. So here is the question that will run beneath everything you are about to hear. How do you spim who fear you more than they fear death itself? To understand the boy in the dark, you have to leave the island behind. You have to go back more than 10 years to a street corner in East Los Angeles, long before anyone in America had ever heard the word Saipan. His name was Guy Gabaldon. He was born in the spring of 1926, one of 7 children in a Mexican-American family that never had quite enough of anything. By the age of 10, he was already working, shining shoes down on Skid Row, learning the city the way street kids learn it, fast, watchful, and unafraid. He ran with a rough, mixed crowd of every color the neighborhood had to offer. He was small, he was stubborn, and he trusted his own read of a man's face more than any rule handed down from above. Nothing about him looked like the makings of a legend, and that is exactly the point. He was ordinary, he was nobody. Then at 12 years old, something quiet happened that would decide the rest of his life. He moved in with a family that was not his own, the Nakanos, a Japanese-American household who took Shoeshine Boy in off the street and never once let him feel like a guest. He ate at their table. He slept under their roof. He tagged along to language classes with their children, and somewhere in all of that, without ever meaning to, he learned to speak Japanese. Not the careful, polished Japanese of a school book, the other kind, the fast, rough, everyday Japanese of a crowded kitchen full of kids. Backstreet Japanese, the kind of Japanese you can only learn by being loved by the people who speak it. For a few short years, Guy Gabaldon had 2 families, 2 languages, 2 worlds, and he belonged completely to both. Then came the 7th of December, 1941. When the bomb on Pearl Harbor, the ground shifted under every Japanese family in America, including the one that had raised him. Within months, a single order signed in Washington swept more than 100,000 people of Japanese descent out of their homes along the West Coast and shipped them inland behind barbed wire into guarded camps in the desert and the mountains. Most of them were American citizens. They had broken no law. Their only crime was the shape of their eyes and the sound of their names. The Nakanos were among them. The family that had fed Guy Gabaldon taught him their words and treated him as their own blood. That family was loaded onto trains and taken away, watched over by American soldiers with rifles. Sit with that for a moment. The people who had shown him the greatest kindness he had ever known were now prisoners of the country he called home. And what did he do? He went to war, not against them. He would insist to the end of his life that it was never against them. But the enemy waiting across the ocean wore their faces and spoke their language, and there was no clean way to fight the one without being asked over and over which side he truly belonged to. On his 17th birthday in the spring of 1943, Guy Gabaldon walked into a recruiting office and joined the United States Marine Corps. He had tried the Navy first and been turned away over a bad ear. The Marines were not so picky. The Marines took him. The Corps had no idea what it was holding. Here was a teenager who could speak the enemy's language, not the way a translator speaks it, but the way the enemy actually spoke it, in the kitchen, in anger, in fear. So they sent him to a Japanese language school, and then they handed him a job with a title that sounded almost gentle: Scout and Observer, 2nd Marine Division. What that title really meant was something, and it was terrible. Guy Gabaldon would be the man who walked toward the enemy, while everyone else was trying to stay alive by walking away. But to understand why that job would very nearly kill him, and why the people he walked toward would choose to die rather than let him take them alive, you cannot start with the boy. You have to start with the wall. Because there was a wall between these two nations, a wall of contempt and fear that had been rising brick by brick for years before Guy Gabaldon ever set foot on a landing craft. And here is the strange truth about that wall, the part the recruiting posters never showed. In the years before the war, Japan did not fear America. Japan looked down on it. To much of the Japanese military and to the society that fed and worshipped it, the American was a soft creature. Rich, certainly, mighty in machines, in factories, in money, but hollow on the inside, a people who loved comfort more than honor, who thought as scattered individuals instead of as one unbreakable body, who had no Bushido, no warrior's code running in their veins. The West, young Japanese soldiers were taught, was decadent and lazy, strong in steel and weak in spirit. And in the war they believed was coming, spirit was supposed to be everything. So when the United States began to squeeze, cutting off trade, freezing Japanese money, and finally choking off the oil that fed Japan's war in China and its armies pushing south into Asia, Tokyo did not read that pressure as strength. It read it as insult. The oil embargo of 1941 was a knife laid against Japan's throat. Everyone understood that. But it was a knife held, they believed, by a soft and unworthy hand. Japan was certain of one thing above all others, that its discipline, its endless willingness to die, its sheer collective will would shatter the spoiled and comfortable Americans the very first time real blood was spilled on real sand. And in the beginning, the world seemed to agree with them. Because in the opening months of the war, Japan did not merely fight the West. It humiliated it. Pearl Harbor left the American battleship fleet burning in the mud of its own harbor. Within days, the mighty British were sent to the bottom off Malaya. Singapore, the great fortress of the British Empire in the east, surrendered with tens of thousands of men inside it. The Philippines fell. On the Bataan Peninsula, an American and Filipino army was starved into surrender and then marched to death by the thousands along a road that would live in infamy. Everywhere the Japanese soldier looked in that first year, he saw the proof of everything he had been promised. The white man was soft. The white man broke. The white man surrendered. They were not afraid. They were confident, dangerously, catastrophically confident, and that confidence is where the true story begins. Because fear is not something a proud nation feels at the start of a war. Fear is something it learns, slowly, in the dark, at a cost almost too high to speak of. Over the next 3 years, in the rotting jungle mud of Guadalcanal, on a reef where the tide betrayed 1,000 men, and at last in the caves of a small island where a lone boy from East Los Angeles would come crawling with nothing in his hands but his voice, Japan would learn to be afraid. It would learn to fear one enemy above all the others, the American Marine, more than it feared hunger, more than it feared its own emperor's anger, more, in the end, than it feared death itself. Guadalcanal was where the confidence began to die. In August of 1942, in the first great American offensive of the war, the United States Marines came ashore on a strip of jungle in the Solomon Islands that almost no one back home could have found on a map. It was hot in a way that rots a man from the inside out. The rain came and did not stop. The mud swallowed boots whole, and somewhere in that green darkness waited an enemy who had been promised, and who fully believed that the soft American would break and run the moment the fighting turned real. For 6 months, on that island, the Americans did not break, and they did not run. The Japanese soldier who came to Guadalcanal expecting a coward met something he had not been prepared for. He met riflemen who could shoot. He met men who dug in and held ground they had no business holding. And above all, he met artillery, walls of American steel that came down out of the sky and the sea and turned the jungle into a slaughterhouse. The reports the Japanese officers wrote in those first campaigns are a strange thing to read because you can feel two truths fighting inside them. On one page, grudging respect. The American infantryman is skilled. He handles his grenades well. He is backed by artillery fire of a kind we have never faced. And then, on the very next page, the old contempt comes crawling back. The American lacks initiative, they wrote. He scouts poorly. He leans on his machines because he has no spirit of his own. They looked at the mountains of supplies the Americans left behind, the food, the fuel, the ammunition, stacked higher than a man, and instead of fear, they felt a sneer. Spoiled, they thought. Soft. A rich man's army that would crumble the moment its comforts ran out. At this stage of the war, the Japanese thought they were fighting a lesser man. A capable enemy, yes, but an inferior one, inferior where it counted, inferior in the soul. That belief was about to break, and what replaced it was not respect. It was dread. The change did not come from any single battle. It came from something the Japanese soldiers could see with his own eyes, month after month, and could not explain away no matter how hard his officers tried. The Americans did not stop coming. You would sink their ships, and more ships would appear on the horizon, newer and larger than the ones before. You would shoot their planes out of the sky, and the next morning the sky would be black with more of them. You would kill their men in numbers that should have shattered any army on earth, and fresh men would step off the boats to take their places, rested and fed and endless. Meanwhile, the ranks around you grew thinner, younger, hungrier. The reinforcements that were promised never arrived. The supply ships were supposed to feed you rusted at the bottom of the sea. And slowly, in the quiet of the caves and the foxholes, a new understanding settled over the Japanese soldier like a cold fog. He was not fighting a soft man. He was fighting a machine that could not be exhausted. A nation on the far side of the world, untouchable, pouring out steel and men without end. Fighting the American, he was learning, was like fighting the tide itself. You could hold it back for an hour, a day, a week, but the sea does not get tired. The sea does not run out, and in the end, the sea takes everything. And then, in November of 1943, on a speck of coral most of the world had never heard of, that tide came in for real. And it wore the uniform of the United States Marine Corps. Its name was Tarawa. If you want to understand why the Japanese soldier came to fear the Marine the way a man fears a force of nature, you have to understand what happened on the island of Bitio in 76 hours. Bitio was almost nothing. A flat scrap of coral in the Gilbert Islands, barely 2 miles long, so small you could walk its length in an afternoon. But on that scrap of coral, the Japanese had built one of the most concentrated fortresses on Earth, more than 4,000 defenders. Over 500 pillboxes, bunkers, and firing positions, many roofed with coconut logs and sand and steel, sunk into the ground where naval shells could not reach them. It was said afterward that the island's commander, Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, had boasted that 1 million men could not take Tarawa in 100 years. The 2nd Marine Division came to prove him wrong, and the sea itself nearly stopped them. The landing plan relied on amphibious tractors to carry the first 3 assault waves across the reef, while the conventional channel craft carrying later waves needed sufficient water. American planners knew the tide posed a serious risk, and Major Frank Holland had warned that a neap tide might leave the reef impassable. On the morning of the 20th of November, the first LVT waves crossed the reef and landed more than 1,500 Marines, although they suffered heavy losses. Conventional landing craft carrying later waves grounded on the reef, forcing many of their passengers to wade hundreds of yards under fire. For 76 hours it went on like that, at a range so close that Marines and Japanese killed each other with rifles, grenades, bayonets, and bare hands across a few feet of coral. There was almost nowhere to take cover. There was almost nowhere to fall back to. There was only forward into the guns, one bunker at a time. When it was over, the cost stunned the nation back home. More than 1,000 Marines were dead. More than 2,000 more were wounded. And all of it for a piece of coral you could cross on foot in an hour. For the first time, Americans saw film of their own dead floating in the surf of a Pacific island, and a country that had believed the war was being won on the cheap suddenly understood what it was really going to cost. But look at what happened on the other side of that beach. Because that is where the fear was born. Of the more than 4,000 Japanese defenders on Bitio, almost none surrendered. When the guns finally fell silent, the Americans took just 70 Japanese soldiers alive. 17, alongside a little over 100 Korean laborers who had been forced to build the fortress in the first place. Everyone else, every officer, every gunner, every rifleman, including the admiral who had promised it could never be taken, was dead. They had fought quite literally to the last man. Now hold both of those facts in your mind at the same time, because together they are the whole story of the Pacific War. To the American, Tarawa proved something terrible about the enemy. These men would not quit, they would not break. They would die where they stood, every single one of them, and take as many Marines with them as they could. If a scrap of coral 2 miles long cost 1,000 American lives, what would the next island cost, and the one after that? And Japan itself? And to the Japanese, Tarawa proved something even more terrible about the Marine, because they had done everything right. They had built the perfect fortress. They had made the enemy wade through open water into the mouths of 500 guns. They had killed him by the 1,000, and still, the Marine had kept coming. Wet, bleeding, watching his friends die in the surf beside him, he had climbed that beach anyway and pulled their fortress apart bunker by bunker with his bare hands. What do you do against an enemy like that? An enemy you cannot frighten, cannot exhaust, cannot stop, no matter how perfectly you prepare, no matter how dearly you make him pay. You begin in the deepest part of yourself to be afraid. And out of all that steel and all those men, one figure now stood at the center of the Japanese nightmare. The one who came first, the one who came hardest, the one who walked up a beach of his own dead and did not turn around. The United States Marine. He had become something more than a soldier. He had become a symbol, and a symbol can be shaped. A symbol can be used. Japanese wartime propaganda portrayed American forces as brutal and worn soldiers, and civilians that capture could bring torture, rape, humiliation, or death. Some veterans later recalled a rumor that a Marine had to kill his own parents before joining the Corps, but that particular story should be treated as a reported wartime rumor rather than a documented empire-wide doctrine. The additional claims about criminals, tanks, and children should not be presented as parts of one verified official propaganda campaign without direct evidence. Now sit with what that means, because it changes everything about the story you are watching. The men and women who would soon do the unthinkable were not cowards. They were not fanatics who loved death. They were human beings who, had told as a voice of authority, they had ever trusted that the thing coming toward them across the water was worse than the grave. That the kindest thing a father could do for his children was to make sure the Americans never touched them alive. The fear had been built, brick by brick, for years, and in the summer of 1944 it was about to meet a boy from East Los Angeles who spoke its language. On the 15th of June, 1944, the United States came for Saipan, and this time the stakes were higher than any island before, because Saipan was not just another rock in the ocean. Once the Americans held it and built their airfields on it, the giant new B-29 bombers could reach the home islands of Japan themselves. From Saipan, for the first time, the war could be carried to the cities of the enemy. The Japanese commander on the island understood this perfectly. He knew that if Saipan fell, the skies over Tokyo would open, and so he had orders and every intention to fight to the last man to hold it. It began as it always began, with the guns. For days, the American fleet stood off the island and hammered it. Battleships threw shells that weighed as much as a small car, and the earth itself seemed to come apart. To the Japanese soldiers dug into the coral and the caves, men raised to perceive that spirit could defeat any machine. This was the machine answering back, endless, indifferent, and utterly beyond their power to stop. Then the Marines came ashore. Saipan was bigger than the flat little islands that had come before, and crueler in its own way. It rose in the center to a jagged peak the Americans came to call Mount Tapacho, and its slopes were a maze of ridges, ravines, and limestone caves. The Japanese contested the beaches, savagely hurling counterattacks and even tanks at the landing. But as they were driven back, the real battle moved into that broken high ground where they made the Americans dig them out, one cave, one cliff, one ridge at a time. It was slow and it was savage. To clear a single cave, Marines would work forward under fire, and then the flamethrower teams would come up, men carrying jellied fire on their backs, and pour a river of flame into the dark. What came out was not something any of them would ever forget. This was the reality behind the reputation. This was why the men in the caves feared what was coming for them. Not because they were cowards, but because they had seen what fighting did. And among the thousands of Marines grinding their way across that island was a scout and observer named Guy Gabaldon. 18 years old, small, alone in a way that had nothing to do with the men around him. Because Guy Gabaldon looked at this war differently than they did. Where they saw a faceless enemy to be burned out of the rock, he heard, in the shouting from the caves and the pillboxes, the voices of a family that had once fed him at their table. He knew that language. He knew the fear underneath it. And he had an idea so reckless that when he first tried it, his own officers came down on him hard. His idea was this: instead of killing the enemy in the caves, or burning them out, or sealing them in, he would walk up to them alone and talk. The first time he slipped off into the dark on his own, he was breaking orders to do it. A lone Marine wandering into enemy territory at night was a Marine about to get himself killed, and probably others with him. He was reprimanded for it. He was told to stay in line. He did not stay in line. Night after night, Guy Gabaldon went out alone toward the places every other man was trying to avoid. He crawled to the mouths of caves packed with soldiers and terrified families, and he called out to them in their own rough, everyday Japanese, not the voice of a demon, but the voice of a neighbor. He told them the truth, that the Americans had them surrounded, that the fight was over, that if they came out, they would be given water and food and their lives. Imagine what that must have sounded like from inside the cave. For years you have been told this man is a monster who eats children. And now, out of the darkness, that monster is speaking to your children in the language of home. He is not screaming. He is not shooting. He is offering you a canteen of water and a promise you have been taught is a trap. Some did not believe it. Some never would. But some did. By early July, the situation on Saipan was hopeless for the defense. Their commander, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, wounded and starving along with what was left of his army, had given his final order. He would send his men into the largest suicide charge of the entire Pacific War. In the dark hours before dawn on the 7th of July, they came. Thousands of men, some of them wounded, some armed with nothing more than bayonets lashed to poles, pouring forward out of the northern end of the island in the American lines to die on their feet rather than live on their knees. They crashed into the defenders in a wave that lasted for hours. When it was finally over, more than 4,000 of them lay dead. Both General Saito and the admiral beside him, Chuichi Nagumo, the same officer who had once commanded the carriers that struck Pearl Harbor, took their own lives rather than be captured. The men who had begun the war in triumph ended it in the rocks of Saipan by their own hands. And into the wreckage of that broken army the very next day walked Guy Gabaldon. According to Gabaldon's later account, subsequently repeated in official Marine Corps commemorations, on the 8th of July he used 2 prisoners and Japanese officers to help persuade more than 800 soldiers and civilians to emerge. The episode became central to his legend, but the exact number and the extent to which he acted entirely alone remained disputed. By the time his war was over, across Saipan and the neighboring island of Tinian, the number of people Guy Gabaldon brought in alive was counted at around 1,500. His commanding officer would recommend him for the Medal of Honor. But this is not a story that lets you off easy, and honesty demands that we stop here and tell the harder truth. That number, 1,500, is largely Gabaldon's own account of what he did, and not every man who served beside him agreed with it. In the years afterwards, some fellow Marines pushed back. One who served on Saipan called him a self-promoter, a man who had grown his own legend in the retelling. Others claimed he could be rough, even cruel with the very prisoners he took, though those accounts were never proven. His commanding officer recommended him for the Medal of Honor, but the recommendation was not approved, and he received the Silver Star. In 1960, his award was upgraded to the Navy Cross. The available official record does not establish that the Hollywood film caused the upgrade. So was he a saint? No, he was a scrappy, stubborn kid from Skid Row who had bent the rules his whole life and went right on bending them in the middle of a war. He was a real, flawed, complicated human being, but something happened on that island that no dispute can erase. Hundreds of people who had been marked for death, soldiers who were supposed to die charging, mothers who were supposed to die on the rocks, walked off Saipan alive because one young man refused to see them as the monsters he had been sent to kill. And that is more than most men leave behind them in a lifetime. And yet, here is the wound at the center of this story. Even Gabaldon could not reach them all. Because at the northern tip of Saipan, on the high cliffs above the sea, the fear the propaganda had built came due in full. During the final days of the battle, and around the time Saipan was declared secure, American troops watched Japanese civilians, whole families, hundreds of them, move toward the northern cliffs, where many jumped or otherwise took their own lives. The Americans below screamed for them to stop. They set up loudspeakers. They pushed Japanese-speaking men to the front to shout that it was safe, that no one would be harmed, that the terror they had been promised was a lie. A few listened, most did not, and where families hesitated at the edge, there were reports of Japanese soldiers hidden in the rocks, shooting down the ones who dared to choose life. These were not soldiers dying in battle. These were mothers and grandfathers and small children ending themselves because they had been convinced, all the way down to the bone, that the young men waving and shouting below them were demons who would do worse. That is what fear can do when it is fed for long enough. That is what it costs. And the men who watched it happen never, ever forgot it. But we would be lying to you if we said that that fear was built on propaganda alone. Because the terrible truth is that some of it had roots in the real world, in things that happened on both sides of the line. The Japanese soldier had learned to fight in ways that made mercy almost impossible. Again and again, men would raise their hands to surrender, and then as the Americans came close to take them in, pull the pin on a hidden grenade, killing themselves and everyone reaching out to help them. American medics, moving unarmed to save a wounded enemy, were cut down this way, so the Americans learned out of grim necessity to stop trusting a raised hand. And sometimes that meant men who truly wanted to surrender were shot before they ever got the chance. To the Japanese watching from the caves, that looked like proof of everything they had been told. And there was a darker stain still on the American side. A small number of servicemen, hardened past recognition by the savagery of this war, began taking pieces of the enemy dead as trophies. Skulls, teeth, ears. It was never the many, but it was real, and word of it spread, and it horrified the American high command so deeply that strict orders came down forbidding it. To the Japanese, though, the rumor needed no proof. It confirmed the monster they already believed in. This was the machinery of the Pacific Wars by the summer of 1944. A closed loop of terror. Japan told people the Americans were beasts. Frightened, cornered Japanese soldiers did things that made the Americans stop trusting them. The Americans, in turn, grew harder and colder, and a few crossed lines that fed the very legend that had started it all. Each side handed the other fresh proof that the enemy was not human, and into that loop, a lone boy from East Los Angeles had thrown his voice, and for a few hundred souls he had broken it. He had proven, in the only language that mattered, that the monster was a lie, but Saipan was not the end of the fear. It was a warning of what was still to come. Because the Americans were closer now, island by island, they were closing the distance to Japan's own shore. And ahead of them lay one final stepping stone before the home islands themselves, a place where the fear the Marines had planted would grow into a harvest of death so vast that it would change how the war itself was allowed to end. Its name was Okinawa. Okinawa lay roughly 340 miles southwest of Kyushu, the southernmost of Japan's main islands. To American planners, it was a crucial base for the planned invasion of Japan. The next scheduled objective was southern Kyushu under Operation Olympic, followed later by an assault on the Tokyo region under Operation Coronet. The Americans came ashore on the 1st of April, 1945, and for nearly 3 months, Okinawa became the bloodiest ground of the entire Pacific War, so drenched in shell fire that the survivors gave it a name of its own, the Typhoon of Steel. The Japanese commander, Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, had learned the lessons written in the blood of every island before this one. He did not waste his men on the beaches. He pulled them back into the hills of the south, into a honeycomb of caves and tunnels and fortified ridges, and he made the Americans pay for every yard in a currency of lives. The rain turned the fighting into a nightmare of mud and corpses. The ridges changed hands again and again, each one costing hundreds of men. It was Tarawa and Saipan and every hell that had come before, multiplied and stretched out across weeks that felt like years. And this time, the horror was not only on the land. Out at sea, through the last of their strength at the American fleet in the form of the kamikaze, young pilots who flew their aircraft deliberately straight into the hulls of American ships. They came in waves of hundreds. Off Okinawa, that suicidal storm killed several thousand American sailors and turned the waters around the island into a graveyard of burning ships. Japan even sent out its greatest battleship, the mighty Yamato, on a mission from which its commanders did not expect it to return. The plan called for the ship to fight its way to Okinawa and beach itself as a fixed-gun battery. Although the force was initially authorized only limited fuel, local personnel loaded additional fuel, so the claim that Yamato sailed with barely enough to reach Okinawa remains disputed. American aircraft found her and sank her before she reached the island. Even the American commander on the ground did not survive Okinawa. Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner was killed by enemy fire in the final days of the battle, and when the end came at last in late June, General Ushijima did what so many Japanese commanders had done before him. Rather than surrender, he took his own life in a cave above the sea. But the soldiers were not the true horror of Okinawa. The true horror was the people, because unlike the tiny garrisons of the outer islands, Okinawa was home. Hundreds of thousands of civilians lived there, farmers, fishermen, families who had done nothing but be born on the wrong island at the wrong time. And they were now trapped in the narrowing space between two armies grinding each other to pieces. By the time the guns fell silent, the dead among them was numbered somewhere between 110,000 and 150,000 souls. Nobody will ever know the exact figure, and every count is an estimate. But by many reckonings, as much as a quarter to a third of the entire civilian population of Okinawa died in those 3 months. Some were killed in the crossfire, caught in the open with nowhere to run. Some starved. Some were schoolgirls, pressed into service as battlefield nurses, died in the shattered caves alongside the soldiers they tended. And some, and this is the part that connects Okinawa back to the cliffs of Saipan and to a wall of fear built over years, some died by their own hands or the hands of their own people. The same terror that had emptied the cliffs of Saipan had followed the Americans here. The people of Okinawa had been told the same lies, that the Americans were demons. That capture meant torture, and worse. And so once again, families chose death over the enemy they had been taught to fear more than death itself. There are accounts of Japanese soldiers handing civilians grenades for exactly that purpose, of fathers taking the lives of their own children, of whole families ending together in the darkness of a cave rather than walk out into the light and take their chances with the men waving them forward. This was the harvest. This was what years of manufactured fear are finally reaped on the last island before Japan. Okinawa strongly influenced American expectations about the cost of invading Japan and became an important part of the context in which the atomic bombs were used. It was not, however, the single factor that determined how the war would end, because when the American planners looked at Okinawa, they did not just see a victory. They saw a warning written in 100,000 graves. If a single island 300 miles offshore had cost this much, this many American dead, this many Japanese fighting to the last man Saipan, this many civilians choosing to die rather than surrender, then what would the invasion of Japan itself cost? The home islands, where every man, woman, and child was being told to resist to the death, where the same fear that emptied the cliffs of Saipan and the caves of Okinawa would be waiting, multiplied by the tens of millions. The numbers the planners came back with were the subject of fierce argument then and ever since, but the projections ran into the hundreds of thousands of American casualties. And on the Japanese side, soldiers and civilians together, driven by that same refusal to surrender, the dead were imagined in the millions. Sit with the terrible logic of that. The very fear that Japan had built to make its people fight harder had now convinced its enemy that conquering Japan the ordinary way would drown both nations in blood. And so, in the first days of August 1945, a different kind of weapon was used. Hiroshima on the 6th of August, Nagasaki on the 9th. 2 cities and a scale of death delivered in a single instant that the world had never seen and has never forgotten. Historians have argued ever since about whether the atomic bombs were necessary, whether their use was justified, and whether another course could have ended the war. Japanese resistance and American fears about the cost of invasion were important considerations, but the decision also involved conventional bombing, blockade invasion planning, the Manhattan Project diplomacy, and the Soviet Union's entry into the war. On the 15th of August, 1945, most Japanese people heard the emperor's voice for the first time as his broadcast announced Japan's acceptance of the Potsdam Terms. Organized hostilities largely ceased, but Japan formally signed the instrument of surrender aboard USS Missouri on the 2nd of September. And now came the moment the whole story had been building toward, the moment the propaganda had never planned for. The Americans arrived. For years, the people of Japan had been promised exactly what would happen when the enemy set foot on their soil. The same horrors the people of Saipan and Okinawa had been promised. Slaughter without end, and so they braced for it. Some hid their daughters, some prepared to die. They waited for the demons. And the demons did not come. What came instead were young men in uniform who set up supply lines and handed out food, who rebuilt roads and restarted schools. The occupation was not a fairy tale. It was a foreign army sitting on a defeated nation, and it had its own crimes and its own frictions, and we would be lying to pretend otherwise. But the wholesale slaughter the propaganda had promised simply never came. The Japanese people, bracing for the end of the world, found themselves looking into the faces of ordinary men. Tired, homesick, human, and slowly, in 1,000 small encounters, a nation began to understand the size of the lie it had been told. The thing they had feared more than death itself, the thing hundreds had leapt off cliffs to escape, had been, in the end, a phantom. A monster built out of words to make a doomed war last a little longer. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, there had already been a boy who knew the truth from the very beginning. Guy Gabaldon never made it to Okinawa. His war had ended before that on the islands where it began. Sometime after his lonely nights, walking toward the caves, he was caught in a machine gun ambush and badly wounded. The scout who had gone out alone so many times finally paid the price for it. He was sent home and given an honorable discharge, still just a teenager. He came back to a country that did not quite know what to do with his story. A Mexican-American kid from Skid Row who had captured more of the enemy with his voice than most men captured with a rifle, and who had done it in part out of love for a Japanese family that its own government had locked behind barbed wire. His life afterward was as complicated as the man himself. The military had turned down that first recommendation for the Medal of Honor. For years, his deeds went largely unspoken. Then, in 1960, Hollywood released a film loosely based on his story, and later that year, his Silver Star was upgraded to the Navy Cross. The timing is documented, but a direct causal connection between the film and the award upgrade has not been established. He spent decades arguing that he deserved the highest honor of all, and he never got it. Some who served beside him doubted his numbers. Some questioned the man. He was proud and stubborn, and he told his own legend loudly, and not everyone loved him for it. He was not a saint. This story has never asked you to believe he was. But when Guy Gabaldon died in 2006, at the age of 80, this much was true and could not be taken from him. On an island soaked in fear, when every voice of authority on earth was screaming that these two peoples could only destroy each other, one 18-year-old had crawled into the dark alone and proven that the monster was a lie. And hundreds of human beings who were supposed to die on Saipan lived out their lives because of it. So we return at the very end to the question we began with. Why did the Japanese come to fear the American Marine more than they feared death itself? They feared him because they were taught to by a machine of propaganda that turned a soldier into. They feared him because the reality was frightening enough on its own. The relentless assaults, the endless tide of steel, the man who walked up a beach of his own dead and did not turn around. And they feared him because fear, once it is fed, grows on its own in the dark until a mother believes the kindest thing she can do is carry her children over a cliff. But the deepest truth of this story is the one the propaganda could never allow. That behind the monster they had been promised, there was only ever a human being. Sometimes a hard one, sometimes a frightening one, and sometimes on a black night on Saipan, with a canteen in his hand and a few rough words of Japanese on his tongue, a boy from East Los Angeles who wanted nothing more in this world than for them to live. They feared the American Marine more than death itself, and they were never more wrong about anything in their lives.